Welcome, new and returning guests, to Crypto Convos, a monthly video series hosted by Berk, Chief Strategy Officer at Quantum Xchange. Today's episode is part 2 of our discussion with Adam Gordon, edutainer with ITProTV, on how the individual is the weakest link in the security chain, the importance of continuous professional training, and what it will take to secure the metaverse. Enjoy.
I like to throw a different spin on sort of legislation here and see how you feel about it. See if you agree with me or maybe not, right? So one thing that, and I'm specifically talking about compliance and cybersecurity. Right? We've seen HIPAA, we've seen GDPR, we've seen PCI, a payment card, and despite this compliance legislation, right? The TJX hack happened, right? Okay, the WEP is enough, right? Because compliance says it must be encrypted. Well, that's encryption. Now we're done, right? So compliance typically sets a minimum bar to pass, and we all know that, right? Like I can fire fire code compliant a building, but it still burns, right? Like we right? Like compliance doesn't mean you're there, right? Compliance sets a minimum bar we hope that everybody will reach, so that we at least are the opinion I am of, though, is that when you do create compliance law that sets a minimum bar and it sort of absolves people of having to do more, right? So at this point, well, how much should I do to educate, to secure, to encrypt my data, my people, right? Versus, well, there's a standard I must reach, and when I've reached it, and what is the impetus for people to do more than that if compliance is in effect?
So it's an interesting paradigm, right? And an interesting quandary, because you're right? We set a baseline of expectation with regards to whatever the regulatory standard or compliance factor is that we specify, and maybe PCI DSS or whatever it is. Yep. And the majority of, or indeed all, in a heavily regulated sector will comply. They will comply to that level. But you're right, they will not go beyond that. There's no incentive. I think you have to address a couple of things. First of all, do need to understand that what compliance indicates to us is that there are, and usually, not always, you mentioned things like life safety, right? And there are certainly minimum requirements there, but something like PCI DSS and compliance there is not a life safety issue. It's certainly a very important issue, but it has nothing to do with life safety, whereas fire codes do. And I think we have to understand that there are certain things that we're going to have to specify a minimum acceptable level of expectation, of compliance, of behavior, of existence, whatever we want to define that as. And we have to then understand that companies being held accountable to that are going to reach that, however painful that may be over time, and what we need to do to enable it. But you're right, they're not going to go beyond it unless we incrementally move that bar up. And I think what happens over time, what we see the failure in compliance and the gaps that open over time, is the inability to circle back and revisit whether that baseline is still accurate and therefore is timely and appropriate 5, 10, 15, 20 years in. I think when you look at something like CAFE standards, for instance, right, about emissions, right? And you look at the fact that those have been incrementally ratcheted up as a result of various agreements and negotiated settlements and awareness in the global climate space, automakers are continuing to have to chase those standards. They're being phased in. So it's not like today you're at 25 miles per gallon. Guess what? Next model year, you have to be at 40, right? There's a ramp that moves them over time. And I think that's proven to be effective. I think we're lacking the same thing until very recently in the cybersecurity and more broadly the infrastructure and cyber supply chain spaces. I think the Biden administration has taken great strides by comparison to any of their predecessors, to move us in a direction that lays down foundational elements with regards to baselines in the cybersecurity and cybersecurity risk management, third-party risk management spaces, a minimum build of material expectation, and a lot of the new standards that have come out over the last about 17, 18 months. You could certainly look at those things and certainly see where we're moving the dial in those areas, but it's been a long time coming. Many would argue, and I think it's safe to say, and I don't feel uncomfortable saying it's long overdue. This should have been a conversation we were having 20, 30 years ago, not having and acting on today. But I do think we're seeing more evidence of the fact that We see nation-state sponsored activity taking place that is not only attaching itself to critical infrastructure, which is, let's be honest, one of the clear reasons why these moves are occurring, but it's also affecting private industry. And I think when you have that 1-2 punch where there's national security and life safety because of critical infrastructure, and corporate profits are also being impacted negatively, I think there is impetus to move. I hate to say and hate to imply that it takes that 1-2 punch and the direness of those two outcomes to motivate. But I think we're clearly seeing the evidence of that motivation because we're moving in a direction where this is becoming a more realistic expectation and we're doing more. I don't know if it will continue because of those motivators. I think a lot of that varies and depends on the geopolitical cycles we're seeing, but it's safe to say that Mr. Putin and in general, although in a very limited and certainly behind the scenes way, his current supporting cabal are not showing signs of backing down. And I think it's safe to say that as a result, there's going to be a lot more chaos before there's any sort of clarity. So we'll see what happens. But I think we do need those things to happen. We need to have them happen more forcefully and in an ongoing incremental way that gives us room to grow over time.
So you packaged here two interesting concepts. And first of all, critical infrastructure, right, is increasingly becoming more automated, right, computer driven, making use of the benefits of computing technology. Now, I spend quite a bit of time myself in SCADA, ICS, BCS security, and generally, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, right, we're talking oil, gas, electric grid, right? These guys are, well, maybe not in the oil industry, but in the electric grid, these guys are pinching pennies so hard the copper's coming off, right? And there's a real so that, you know, they have to decide, you know, am I going to put a security guard out front of the gate, or am I going to try to secure my networks more, right? And there, I think, you know, that has driven to a place where cybersecurity in critical infrastructure is in large part driven by the concept of the secure enclave, right? And I'm sure you've seen this as well. It's like, well, as long as nobody gets in through the front door, then the systems will work and they're fine, right? The moment you get in, well, you know, guess what? It's a no holds barred. You can do anything you want, right? And so this is a very difficult sort of area. And I you know, and you could go either way with this conversation, by the way, because you're aware I taught engineering myself, you know, many years ago, right? Is this a secure by design problem? Is this a problem we resolve through education, or is this a problem we resolve in some other kind of way? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, like many problems that are complex and complicated. You begin to unravel them, you see there's not just one solution, nor is there one catalyst, right, that is laying at the heart of this as a single root cause. Is it a question of secure by design and a lack of clarity around thinking through the IP enablement of closed loop systems that were never designed to run on exposed publicly available networks? Well, just fire up a Showdown browser and you'll be able to see the outcome of that conversation. We don't have to go very far down that road to figure out that that was never a good idea. But clearly, good idea or not, it's been done. You can't go undo 20 or 30 years of ICS, OIT, OT, and SCADA, right? Advancements, we'll put that in air quotes, right? Because advancements are a relative thing. I don't think IP enabling them for remote management with a lack of understanding of the impact of security against that virtual boundary of the secure enclave was actually progress. But that aside, I do think beyond the obvious, right, where you have to go back and re-engineer and, you know, to give the industry credit, right? So you talked about the electrical industry in particular, NERC, an acronym I'm sure you're very familiar with, you know, has done a lot of work around trying to upgrade and create new standards, for instance, right? So the re-enablement and securing of DNP3 is a good example of that. DNP3 initially was never designed, as many of those protocols were not, to be secure, but adding on the requirement now to use it with TLS and to enable it to be encrypted and therefore implemented more securely is certainly a good step in the right direction. The enablement of new standards to require not only encryption, but also definitions of things like what is a routable protocol, what is not a routable protocol, what will we secure, what won't we secure. Whether you agree with their take on that and their direction in the newer standards in CIP 002 and things of that nature, at least they're trying, right? And we have to give them credit for trying, because for many years, nobody tried. They just kind of put their head in the sand and hoped nothing would happen. And it was about physical security. If I couldn't get into a plant, then I probably couldn't attack it. Well, we've proven that that's absolutely the wrong approach. We can attack plants all day sitting on the moon, as long as we have a network connection. And you're unfortunately blinded by the fact that you don't realize you have to secure that inbound traffic, or you're allowing outbound traffic to exfiltrate without examining it to understand what is, essentially hidden in those payloads. And so as a result, it's a combination of things. I don't think education is going to solve that problem. We've tried beating that drum for probably close to 40 years now in the industry. And while it's changing slowly. And I think we're seeing a leapfrog effect where they're leaping over a lot of technologies into awareness of the cloud. And now this idea of a zero trust perimeter, and therefore a rethinking of what a secure enclave is and should be. But it's going to take time. And in the meantime, you've got a lot of critical infrastructure that is being attacked every day.
Yeah.
And, so is it a question now of saying, well, we're going to pull our defensive perimeter back, reimagine it, say, you know what, we're not going to trust anything or anyone. If you can't meet our conditional requirements to verify, you're not getting in. It's going to change the dynamic of how we use and manage and create and enable that infrastructure. I think it's painful, but I think over time it yields better results. A smarter grid is not just about remote enablement. It's about survivability and scalability under adverse conditions. And when you couple what we're seeing in global economic disruptions, social, political disruptions with climate-driven disruptions today, without the capability to create a survivable grid under stress that can be secured, we're all going to be in some very, very dire circumstances. I don't care where you live. I don't care what country you're in. I don't care what you think or do now understand is the current state of affairs. We're not used to rolling blackouts and power outages in the developed world. This is a force of reality in other areas of the world and has been for a long time, probably as long as we've had electricity, at least transmissible electricity at scale anyway. For that kind of thing to happen is going to be an eye-opener and I think a multiplier effect that's going to force entities to really rethink it. The problem is, you tend to see that pendulum swing to the opposite side. Nation states now get involved and it becomes a defensive posture as opposed to a enablement capability, and it leads to a lot of complicated outcomes.
Yeah, so, and I'm now you've hit on a sensitive subject for me. The thing you discussed there was resiliency, right? Like ability to operate under failure, right? And I think, talking about education, I think that all too many engineers or designers go about building their systems believing that if I built one right system that's really, really good, well, then everything else will just work out, right? And basically what I spend most of my time doing these days, right? Like Quantum Xchange is a company that tries to remove single points of failure in cryptography. Why do we remove single points of failure in cryptography? It's because, well, we don't know at what point an implementation is going to fail, a certificate is going to be leaked. We don't know when there's a bad password. We don't know when an algorithm is going to get cracked, right? These things are distinct possibilities, right? We can't mathematically prove these things are truly secure, right? The premise very simply is we don't know what part is going to fail. We just know that at some point, some part is going to fail. And not only that, we may not know what part has failed, right? This is a bit the Byzantine general problem. Like we simply don't know, right? So if one wants to talk about building a dependable system out of unreliable parts, right? Which is, we're very used to doing this with hard drives, right? Like, oh, hard drives will eventually fail. So I'm going to stick a bunch of them in the chassis and then I'll make a RAID array and now I'll be okay, right? And we are building dependable systems out of undependable parts. We don't do that. We don't do that in many, many other parts of our software engineering and our general engineering, right? We build one software stack based with one set of libraries, one algorithm, one access control mechanism, right? And I, of course, see this all over the place in cryptography, but it happens everywhere else. So I guess like one interesting question that sort of flows out of this, because you're evidently on board sort of with that premise, right? How does one build a dependable system or reliable system out of parts that may fail. We've both spent a lot of time in cybersecurity. This is sort of pervasive. Like, this happens in other places as well. Like, by your observation, like, where else? What is another one prime example of here we have single points of failure, weaknesses in the system that could be solved by simply pointing out that they are the bottleneck, that the one component that fails will take the entire thing down?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of examples we see around us every day. We just probably don't really necessarily stop to understand them or even really acknowledge them and interact with them unless they directly affect us, right? So you don't have to go very far. You can go down the street to your local coffee shop, whether it's Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or wherever you consume whatever it may be, and try in the last couple of years, certainly as COVID became a reality for all of us and through the initial supply chain issues that were occurring, try to order certain things that before those disruptions would have been in stock and plentiful. And you can see single points of failure in supply chains, right? Whether it was blueberries, whether it was eggs, whether it was syrup for coffee, the list is endless. Toilet paper, right? Who would have thought toilet paper? Had I only had a crystal ball and known it was going to be toilet paper when COVID started, I'd be doing a very different podcast with you right now, right? The reality is, we don't necessarily know what those single points of failure are all the time. I mean, if we do, obviously, we can take advantage of understanding that, acting ahead of the curve. But the reality is, when we build systems more broadly and we think about how we design them, when it comes to life safety, we've proven individually and collectively as humans that we know how to build systems that are resilient and redundant, and for the most part, barring catastrophic system failure, will get the job done. The fact you could step on an airplane, which is made up of hundreds of thousands of individual parts that don't belong together, let alone belong traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, thousands of feet in the air, and that it works 99.9999% of the time, is amazing. I don't think people really stop and consider just how amazing it is that you strap yourself in to a seat and you fly 500 to 700 miles an hour, thousands of feet above the earth, in defiance of gravity and the laws of physics as we know them, and you don't die, right? And it's the same thing when you drive in a car. It's the same thing when you ride on a train or get on a boat or do anything that's complicated, let alone flying to the moon or launching a satellite, right? I mean, these are really complicated endeavors. We take them for granted today because we're really good at figuring out how to do those complicated things and do them safely and repetitively. But the problem is, when we take things for granted and we don't pay attention to them, the average person stops really caring or understanding or even noticing them until they go bad. And I think single points of failure in design are as much a problem of imagination as they are a problem of strategic direction, right? Because many companies are designing, and you talked about this earlier, I liked the visual you used when you talked about, pinching pennies so tightly they're rubbing the copper off, right? I think it is, unfortunately, and you think about software design, you see this, right? You mentioned it, one stack, one set of libraries, essentially one place that we can enable and therefore create functionality, but we're limited by the boundaries of that stack. The reality is most of those developments are proprietary, right? I mean, nobody really knows what's in the source code for Microsoft Windows. Nobody really knows what's in the source code for Cisco's iOS. We know the commands were exposed and that we can use, but do you really know what those APIs are calling and doing? Not unless it's open sourced. And while we're moving in that direction more, the reality is we're not there. We're never probably going to get there totally. Companies are not going to give up that secrecy in order to give up making money. And as a result of that, there's always going to be this issue of, well, I'm designing it the way I think it should work. I mean, the fact we find bugs on an ongoing basis in hardware and software is proof of the fact that we could have more introspection and probably better product, but we'd have to overcome the bias to collect those secrets and keep them closely held. I do think when it comes to single points of failure, we could do a better job of designing redundancy into systems. Building for obsolescence has unfortunately become a reality of the modern consumer mindset that we all have. Do you really need a new iPhone every year? I mean, just think about the logic of that. I tend to buy and use cell phones for 5, 6, 7 years, right, before I really reach the end of a useful life, unless I have a catastrophic accident where it falls and it's damaged. I don't need a new phone every year. I don't need a new laptop every year. And as a result of that, I think when we build for obsolescence because we want to generate more essential turnover and sales, we don't focus on single points of failure. In fact, and I'm not saying that this is the way it is when I say this, I'm not saying we purposefully build to create single points of failure, but it's clear we're building without as much focus on quality and resiliency as we used to in many areas. And I think as a result, we're seeing the evidence of that, which is higher churn, higher defect rates, and ultimately more money spent to essentially keep our head above water by treading water, as opposed to generating real advances in technologies where we produce less and keep longer. And I think that's unfortunate for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, no, I tend to certainly agree, and I think you're absolutely living up to your title of edutainer in this one. So thank you for that. Now, we've been talking for a while, and we probably should start to wrap up soon. Is there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us? Like anything that's on your mind after this conversation that you'd share with the viewers?
Well, just first, and certainly thank you and the team at Crypto Convos for the opportunity to come and spend some time with you and chat. It's been a really enlightening and certainly eye-opening opportunity to share some thoughts and to have a really interesting conversation. I think, broadly in terms of things we've been talking about, there's a lot of opportunity, right, in the world for you to walk and really keep your head down and perhaps not see what's around you, or I think rarer though it is, an opportunity to raise your head up and perhaps look at the broader vistas that you're engaging with. And I think it's important, regardless of where you come from, what you do, what your focus is, what your opinion is about any of the things that we've been talking about, that you take the time to at least stop, look up, and see that there is more, right, than one possibility. And as a result, more than one path you can trod. And whether that path is one that I, Vince, or you might choose to take is irrelevant. The fact that you're making a choice and that you have options, I think is really what is most important, and probably a great parting thought.
You know what, Adam, I will take that. That is actually very nice. Think for yourself, right? Don't follow the herd. So thank you, Adam, for taking the time to be here. Also, obviously, thanks to our viewers for this inaugural Crypto Convos conversation. Next week's, we're going to talk about DevSecOps and about the harvest now and decrypt later attack. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. And I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you so much, Adam, and hope to see you again next time.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Thank you.